Leave right now. You see this? He's mine now, and there's nothing you can do.
You should walk out of here on your own before someone has to carry you out.
Sir. So the security guard came, and I left. What no one in that room knew, not Vanessa, not Damien, not a single person laughing into their drinks, was that I owned the majority stake in the company they were all celebrating that night. The real question is, why didn't I say a single word? If you want to find out, make sure you subscribe and keep watching because this story is just getting started. I need to go back to the beginning, not because I enjoy revisiting it, but because none of what happened at that gala makes sense without it. You need to understand who I was before that night, and more importantly, why I let things go as far as they did. 6 years ago, I married Vanessa Hart in a small ceremony with fewer than 40 guests. No grand venue, no live band, no ice sculpture centerpiece. She wore a simple ivory dress, and I wore the same navy suit I used for quarterly meetings. Half the guests probably assumed we were doing it on a budget. We weren't. That was just who I was, who I had always chosen to be. Vanessa knew I worked as an independent consultant. She knew I was careful with money. She did not know that Callaway Capital, the investment fund quietly listed as the majority stakeholder of Crestmont Technologies, belonged to my family, and that I was the one running it. That was not an accident. It was a decision I had made 8 years before I ever met Vanessa, and it had cost me more than I expected to maintain. 8 years before our wedding, I had been engaged to a woman named Rachel. We had been together for 3 years, and I believed she loved me the way I loved her, without conditions, without calculation. Then a real estate development deal I had backed fell apart almost overnight. The collapse was temporary. The losses were recoverable. But within 7 days of the news breaking, Rachel had moved out of our shared apartment and stopped returning my calls. She didn't leave a note. She left a gap where something used to be, and I spent a long time trying to figure out exactly what that something was. Eventually, I stopped trying to name it and just accepted the lesson people behave differently when they think you have nothing left. And the only way to know how someone truly sees you is to let them believe you have nothing at all. So that became the rule. No displays, no statements, no revelations, not until I was certain. Not until I felt something I could not explain away. Vanessa and I met at a fundraiser for a technology education nonprofit. She was confident and sharp-tongued in a way that I found genuinely refreshing. She didn't try to impress me. If anything, she seemed slightly annoyed that I had walked into her conversation without being invited. I liked that. We talked for 2 hours, and when I asked for her number, she wrote it on a paper napkin and told me not to lose it. I didn't. I called her the next morning, and we had our first date at a diner near her apartment. Bad coffee. Good conversation. I remember thinking for the first time in years that this might be worth something real. For the first few years of our marriage, I believed I had made the right choice. We argued sometimes, the way all couples do, but there was something underneath the disagreements that held. She laughed at things I found funny. She called me out when I was being unnecessarily stubborn. She made the apartment feel like somewhere I actually wanted to come home to. I didn't need her to know about the fund or the assets or the estate outside the city that I had never mentioned. I just needed what we had to be enough. But somewhere around the 3rd year, something began to shift slowly enough that I kept convincing myself I was imagining it. Damien Wolf joined Crestmont Technologies as Vice President of Business Development on a Tuesday in early spring. I remember the day clearly because Clara called me that afternoon to mention that the new VP had arrived in a black Bentley and had spent his first hour introducing himself to people rather than attending his onboarding. I told her to keep an eye on him. It was the kind of instinct I had learned to trust over the years, not always right, but worth paying attention to. Damien was the kind of man who understood the theater of wealth. The Bentley was only the beginning. He wore a watch that retailed for somewhere around $140,000. He referenced his private yacht the way other people referenced weekend plans. He told stories about meetings in Monaco and dinners in Florence with the casual ease of someone who had decided long ago that impressing people was simply another form of networking. He was very good at it. I had met men like him before, men who had learned that the appearance of success creates its own momentum. What I hadn't anticipated was how quickly Vanessa would find herself caught in that current. It started with small things. She began coming home later than usual, citing project deadlines that her assistant could have handled. She started spending more time on her phone in the evenings, not hiding it exactly, but turned slightly away, her expression carrying something I couldn't quite read. When I asked how her day was, the answers became shorter. Not hostile, just distant, the way a door sounds different when there's nothing behind it anymore. One night I made dinner, nothing elaborate, just pasta and a salad, and she came home 2 hours after I had put it away. She apologized without looking at me, said she had lost track of time and went to shower. I stood in the kitchen for a moment, then cleaned up and went to read. I told myself it was a difficult period at work. I told myself a lot of things in those months. The moment I stopped telling myself things was on a Wednesday evening when Vanessa left her phone on the kitchen counter while she answered the door for a delivery. I was not looking for anything. I was simply standing there when the screen lit up with a message from a contact saved only as D. The preview was short, just a few words about a reservation for the following Friday. Nothing explicitly romantic, nothing that would hold up as proof of anything. But the way the message was written, the shorthand of it, the assumption of familiarity, it told me everything I needed to know about how long this had been going on. I set the phone back down exactly where it had been before. When Vanessa came back into the kitchen, I asked if she wanted tea. She said no. We spent the rest of the evening in the same apartment without speaking more than a dozen words. She went to bed early. I sat in the living room with the lights off for a long time. The next morning, I called Oliver Reed. Oliver had been my attorney for 11 years. He knew everything, the fund, the assets, the structure of Callaway Capital, the full weight of what I had spent years keeping quiet. When I told him I needed him to look into Damian Wolf, he didn't ask why. He said he would start immediately and have something for me within the week. That was Oliver, precise, unsentimental, and completely reliable. What he found came back faster than I expected. Within 4 days, he called me and said there were irregularities in the financial reporting coming out of Damian's division. Vendor payments that didn't match any active contracts. Budget allocations that had been approved at one figure and disbursed at another, with the difference routed through a consulting firm that Oliver could not find any legitimate record of. It wasn't conclusive yet, but it was enough to make the shape of things visible. Damian Wolf was not just a man with a Bentley and a talent for charm. He was stealing from the company carefully, methodically, and with the confidence of someone who believed no one was watching closely enough to notice. Oliver wanted to move immediately. He laid out the case for going to Margaret Sinclair and the board within the week, presenting what we had and letting the internal audit process take over from there. It was the logical approach. It was probably the right approach. But I told him to wait. Looking back, I understand why that decision looks like a mistake, because it was. At the time, I convinced myself I was being strategic. I wanted the full picture. I wanted every transaction documented, every account traced, every thread pulled before anything was put in front of anyone. I told Oliver I needed another few weeks. He said he understood, but his tone told me he wasn't entirely convinced. What I didn't admit to Oliver, what I barely admitted to myself, was that part of me was also waiting on something else. I wanted to know what Vanessa was going to do, not because I expected her to make the right choice. I think by that point I already knew she wouldn't. But there is a particular kind of grief that comes with knowing something and having to live inside that knowledge before you're ready to act on it, and I wasn't ready yet. I wanted the picture to be complete before I decided how to respond to any of it, the fraud, the marriage, all of it at once. So I waited. I went to work. I came home. I made dinner some nights and ordered in on others. I watched Vanessa move through our shared space like someone who had already mentally packed her bags and was just waiting for the right moment to carry them out. I did not push. I did not ask. I told myself that everything happening was simply the accumulation of data information I needed before I could make a clear decision. What I did not account for was that Vanessa would not wait for the right moment either. She would simply manufacture one in the worst possible setting in front of the worst possible audience, and I would be standing on the wrong side of it with nothing left to hold on to. The anniversary gala was 6 weeks after Oliver first called me about the irregularities. 6 weeks of evidence gathering, of quiet phone calls, of watching a marriage dismantle itself from the inside. 6 weeks, and I still hadn't said a word to Vanessa about any of it. I told myself I was being patient. I told myself I was being careful. What I was actually being was slow, and that night at the Imperial Grand Hotel, the cost of that slowness came due all at once. The Imperial Grand Hotel had been built in the 1940s, and whoever designed it understood something about power that most modern architects had forgotten, that a room with 20-foot ceilings and gold-veined marble floors does not merely impress people. It reminds them of their place. Walking in that night in my standard charcoal suit, I was aware of exactly how I appeared against that backdrop. Unremarkable. Forgettable. A man who looked like he had wandered into the wrong event and hadn't yet realized it. That was, of course, entirely intentional, but knowing that didn't make the evening any easier to move through. The ballroom was already full when I arrived. 300 guests in formal wear moving between cocktail tables draped in white linen, the kind of crowd where every handshake is a transaction and every smile is an audition. I recognized most of the faces. Several of them were there in part because of decisions I had made years ago. Capital. I had committed risks I had absorbed so that the company they were celebrating could survive long enough to become worth celebrating. None of them knew that. As far as anyone in that room was concerned, I was Ethan Calloway, independent consultant husband of Vanessa Hart from the communications department, a man whose most distinguishing feature was that he had nothing particularly distinguishing about him. I found a position near the far end of the room, close enough to observe and far enough from the center to avoid being drawn into conversations I didn't want to have. I took a glass of sparkling water from a passing tray and waited. I was good at waiting. I had spent 6 weeks doing very little else. Damien entered 40 minutes after I did, which I suspected was calculated. He wore a suit that had clearly been made for him, specifically the kind of fit that cannot be achieved off a rack, and he worked the room the way a politician works a fundraiser, moving from group to group with practiced ease, laughing at the right moments, leaning in when someone said something important. People lit up when he approached them. He had that quality, the ability to make whoever he was speaking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. I had met men like him before, and I knew exactly how much of it was real, but I also understood why it worked. People want to be seen. Damien was exceptional at performing the act of seeing them. Vanessa stayed close to him all evening. I watched her from across the room, not with jealousy anymore, but with something closer to the feeling you get when you've read the last page of a book before finishing it. You already know how it ends, but you still have to sit through the remaining chapters. She was animated in a way I hadn't seen in months, laughing more freely than she had in our apartment in longer than I could precisely recall. Once she glanced in my direction. Our eyes met for a fraction of a second before she looked away back toward Damien, as though the moment of contact had been accidental and required no acknowledgement. I moved toward them at one point, not to confront anything, just to be present, to stand in the same space and see what happened. When I reached them, Vanessa turned to me with an expression I hadn't seen her use on me before. It was the expression people use on someone they have already decided is irrelevant. Her voice was low but not quiet enough for only me to hear. "Ethan, what are you doing over here? You don't really fit with this crowd." Damien glanced at me sideways and said nothing. He didn't need to. The way he returned his attention to his drink said everything his silence was designed to say. 2 colleagues standing nearby caught the exchange. One of them found something on the floor suddenly interesting. The other smiled into his champagne glass. The small, careful smile of someone who is entertained but doesn't want to be caught being entertained. I stood there for a moment, then took a step back and returned to my position near the wall. There was nothing to be gained from responding, and I knew it. What I hadn't known was that the evening was only just beginning to turn. Margaret Sinclair had been scheduled to open the formal portion of the event at 9 o'clock. She was standing near the stage speaking quietly with two board members when Vanessa crossed the room and stepped up to the microphone without announcement. The room shifted the way rooms do when something unexpected breaks the planned order of things. Conversations trailed off. People turned. The event coordinator near the stage made a small aborted movement toward the podium before deciding against interfering. Vanessa tapped the microphone once and smiled at the crowd. It was a confident smile, the kind that assumes the audience is already on your side. "I know this isn't on the program," she said, "but I've spent a long time not saying something that I should have said, and tonight feels like the right moment." She looked directly at me across the room. "My marriage is over." The silence that followed was not the dramatic kind you read about in stories. It was the confused kind, the silence of 300 people simultaneously trying to determine whether this was a joke, a toast gone sideways, or something genuinely unraveling in real time. Then Vanessa extended her hand toward Damien, and he crossed the floor to stand beside her with the ease of a man who had been expecting this invitation. And the silence in the room changed quality entirely. She kept her eyes on me while she spoke, which I think was meant to be a final act of power. "He has no ambition, no future, and honestly, he doesn't belong in this room." She said it the way people say things they've rehearsed without wanting it to sound rehearsed. Then she looked at the security guard near the entrance and nodded once. Damien leaned toward the microphone. His voice carried the smooth, unbothered confidence of someone who had never once considered that a room might not be on his side. He told me to leave, that this was a night for people who had actually built something, and I had no place among them. The guard approached me. He was polite about it. Hand extended slightly, eyes apologetic in the way that people in service roles learn to be when they're asked to do something uncomfortable. I looked at him for a moment, then set my glass down on the nearest table and walked toward the exit. I did not look back at Vanessa. I did not look at Damien. I had nothing to say to either of them that the next few minutes wouldn't say better than I could. I was 12 steps from the door when Margaret Sinclair's voice came through the microphone, calm and absolute, cutting through the residual murmur that had filled the room. "Mr. Calloway, I think you should stay. What I'm about to say concerns you directly." I stopped walking. The room went quiet in a different way this time, sharper, more attentive, the way people go quiet when they sense that something real is about to happen. Margaret had been chair of Crestmont's board for 9 years. She was 71 years old, had built and sold 2 companies before joining the board, and was the only person in the building who knew the full structure of Callaway Capital's position in Crestmont. She had never been given to dramatic statements. When she spoke, it was because she had already decided that speaking was necessary, and she did not waste words getting to the point. "Crestmont Technologies has reached its 10th anniversary," she said to the room, her voice carrying the steadiness of someone who does not need a microphone to be heard. "And I want to be accurate about how we got here. This company survived its 3rd year because of a capital commitment made by a private investment fund when no institutional backer was willing to take the risk. That fund did not ask for recognition. It did not ask for a seat at the table or a name on the wall. It asked only that its involvement remain confidential, and we honored that request for 7 years. The room was completely still. Callaway Capital holds the controlling interest in this company. The person who runs Callaway Capital has been standing in this room tonight." Margaret looked across the ballroom toward me. "He was just asked to leave." I watched the understanding move through the crowd, the way a current moves through water. First the people closest to the stage, then outward, a visible wave of recalibration passing from face to face. Vanessa's expression was the one I found myself studying without meaning to. The confidence drained out of it in stages like water finding the cracks in something that had seemed solid a moment before. Damien's face was harder to read. He had more practice keeping it composed, but his jaw had tightened and his hand had stilled around his glass. Clara was standing near a side column where she had been positioned since before the event started. When my eyes found her, she gave a single small nod. Oliver had been in the building for the last hour waiting. Oliver entered through the side door as if on a schedule because he was on a schedule. He crossed to the center of the room with the quiet authority of a man who has no interest in theater but understands its utility. He stopped a few feet from Damien and addressed him directly in a voice pitched perfectly for the surrounding audience to hear. "Mr. Wolf, my name is Oliver Reed. I represent Callaway Capital. I'd like to draw your attention to a matter involving $4.3 million transferred from the Alpha Project budget to an entity called Wolf Consulting LLC over the course of the past 18 months. I have the transaction records, the account registrations, and the internal approval chains. All of it." Damien said nothing for a long moment. Then, "That's an internal accounting matter. It has nothing to do with—" Oliver cut him off not unkindly. "It has everything to do with a federal wire fraud statute, but we can discuss the specifics another time." The people who had been standing closest to Damien began to move casually but unmistakably, creating distance the way people create distance from something that has started to smell wrong. The event coordinator had abandoned any attempt at managing the evening. No one was looking at the stage anymore. Everyone was looking at Damien or at me or at Vanessa, trying to reassemble the story they thought they'd been watching into something that made sense with the new information. I turned and walked out into the corridor. Not because I was done. Everything that needed to happen in that room was already happening without me. I walked out because I had nothing left to prove in there, and I was very tired of standing in rooms where I had been performing a version of myself that no longer served any purpose. The hallway outside the ballroom was quiet, the thick carpet absorbing sound from the event behind me. I stood near a window that looked out over the hotel's courtyard, and I let myself be still for the first time all evening. I heard Vanessa's heels on the marble before I heard her voice. "Ethan?" She came around the corner, her composure reassembled with visible effort. "I didn't know. I swear to you, I had no idea what you... I looked at her, not with anger. The anger had burned out somewhere during the 6 weeks of waiting, and what was left was something quieter and harder to name. "You didn't know about the money," I said. "I know you didn't. That's not the part that matters." She shook her head. "I made a terrible mistake. I let someone convince me that what I had wasn't enough, and 3 weeks ago, I said Clara was in the elevator with you and Damien. You didn't notice her. You told him that I had nothing to hold you." I let the sentence sit for a moment. "Not that I was poor. Not that I didn't make enough. You said I had nothing. You'd already decided who I was, and I wasn't worth staying for. The money was never the variable, Vanessa. You were." She opened her mouth and then closed it again. Her eyes were bright in the way that precedes tears, and I believed in that moment that the emotion was genuine. I believed she was sorry. I also understood in a way I hadn't fully articulated to myself until that second that her sorrow was not enough to reopen a door that had been closing for a very long time. I turned and walked toward the exit at the far end of the corridor. I did not look back. Not because I was making a statement, but because for the first time in 6 weeks, I had nothing left to wait for. Silver Pine Estate sits on 11 acres of private land outside Ashford, on the western edge of a lake that doesn't appear on most public maps. I had purchased the property 7 years before I met Vanessa, and in all the years of our marriage I had never mentioned it to her. Not because I was hiding it specifically, but because it belonged to a part of my life I had kept separate, the part that existed before the performance, before the ordinary apartment, and the plain suits, and the careful management of what I let people see. Driving there the night of the gala, I felt the distance between that world and the one I had just left expand with every mile, and by the time I turned onto the gravel path through the tree line, I had the strange sensation of returning to something I hadn't realized I'd been missing. I spent the first night alone. I didn't call Oliver. I didn't call Clara. I made coffee at 2 in the morning and sat on the back terrace looking at the lake, which was flat and dark and entirely indifferent to everything that had happened, and I found that indifference more comforting than anything a person could have said to me. Clara arrived the next morning without being asked. That was characteristic of her. She had an instinct for when presence was more useful than permission. She let herself in through the side entrance, put a proper breakfast on the kitchen counter, and sat across from me without filling the quiet with unnecessary words. We had worked together for 9 years. She knew when to talk and when to simply be in the room. Eventually I said, "Oliver wants to move on Damien." "Oliver has everything he needs," Clara said. "He's been ready for 2 weeks." "I know." I turned my coffee cup in my hands. "What do you think I should do about the rest of it?" Clara considered this for a moment with the seriousness it deserved. "I think you already know what you're going to do. I think you've known since you walked out of that corridor last night. The only thing left is deciding how long you're going to sit here before you admit it to yourself." She wasn't wrong. The fantasy of a cleaner ending, some orchestrated reversal, some moment where the people who had humiliated me were made to understand in precise terms what they had underestimated, had burned itself out somewhere on the drive to the estate. What I was left with was simpler and considerably less satisfying. I wanted it to be over. Not resolved in some theatrical sense. Just over. The divorce, the company situation. All of it, I wanted the process to begin so that I could begin whatever came after it. I called Oliver that afternoon and told him to proceed. The board convened an emergency session within days of the gala. Oliver presented the full documentation, 7 transactions across 18 months, each routed through Wolf Consulting ELLC, a shell entity registered in Delaware with no employees, no active contracts, and no business purpose beyond receiving wire transfers totaling $4,300,000. The audit committee had been quietly reviewing supplementary records since Oliver first flagged the irregularities, and what they had found corroborated everything. Damien had been careful, but not careful enough. He had underestimated the thoroughness of the people watching him, which was, I had come to understand, a habit of men who have never been held accountable for anything. Damien was suspended pending investigation and formally terminated within the week. The civil suit was filed shortly after. Oliver also forwarded the complete file to the relevant federal authorities, and within a month, Damien's accounts had been frozen and his assets were under review. The Bentley was repossessed by the financing company that had been quietly funding it. The penthouse he had been leasing in downtown Ashford at a monthly rate that would have required most people to save for half a year was listed for sale within 6 weeks, which told me the lease had been backed by the same sources now under investigation. The part Vanessa learned last, the part that arrived with particular cruelty, was that every extravagant dinner, every weekend trip, every small luxury Damien had used to construct his version of himself in her eyes had been paid for with money stolen from the company where she worked. She had been, without knowing it, a prop in a con that had also victimized her. I did not feel satisfaction when Clara told me this. I felt something more like the particular sadness that comes from watching a mistake complete itself. Vanessa submitted her resignation from Crestmont the week after the gala. I heard this through Clara, not through any direct contact. The communications department predictably could not function with its manager at the center of the most discussed event in the company's 10-year history. She made the decision herself, which I respected even at the distance I was maintaining. It was the right call, and making right calls in the aftermath of catastrophic wrong ones is harder than people acknowledge. The divorce was handled entirely through attorneys. Oliver on my side, a woman named Patricia Hale on hers. The process was civil in both the legal and behavioral sense. There were no contested assets, no arguments over the apartment or its contents, no demands designed to punish or extract. I had no interest in any of it. What I had in the apartment was furniture and 6 years of a life that no longer existed, and I was willing to leave all of it behind if it meant the paperwork concluded faster. Vanessa sent me a letter 3 weeks into the process. Handwritten 4 pages, the kind of letter that clearly took several attempts to get to a final draft. She was honest in it, which I had not been entirely certain she was capable of anymore. She wrote about the moment she realized that everything Damien had shown her had been fabricated. She wrote about the elevator conversation that Clara had overheard, and she did not make excuses for it. She wrote that she had convinced herself she was being practical, choosing security and ambition over stagnation, but that what she had actually done was choose a performance over a person. The last paragraph said simply that she was sorry not for being discovered, but for who she had become in the months before anyone found out. I read it twice. Then I folded it and placed it in the top drawer of the desk at Silverpine, and I did not respond. Not because the letter wasn't genuine, and not because I was punishing her with silence. I didn't respond because there was nothing left to negotiate between us, and writing back would have suggested otherwise. The Callaway Foundation had been in planning stages for over a year before any of this happened. It was something I had been building quietly, a scholarship and mentorship program for technology students from low-income backgrounds in the Ashford area, the kind of pipeline that would have changed the trajectory of several people I had known growing up had it existed then. The public launch had been scheduled for the spring, and I saw no reason to delay it, because my personal life had collapsed in the interim. If anything, the timing felt clarifying. There was nothing like watching an entire room of people misread you to remind you that the only version of yourself worth presenting publicly is the one that's actually true. The launch event was held on a Saturday morning in mid-April in a renovated event space in central Ashford. It was nothing like the Imperial Grand Hotel exposed brick folding chairs, a small podium with a microphone that required adjustment before anyone could use it properly. About 150 people were there. City officials, university department heads, a handful of journalists, and the first cohort of 12 scholarship recipients who ranged in age from 17 to 22 and looked simultaneously thrilled and unsure of what they had walked into. I found their uncertainty more comfortable than the polished confidence of the gala crowd. Margaret Sinclair was seated in the front row. Oliver stood near the back. Clara had organized most of the logistics and was accordingly everywhere at once. For the first time in many years, I was standing in a room as myself, not as a consultant, not as a background figure, not as a husband performing normalcy. Just Ethan Callaway, which was something I had spent a long time treating as a liability, and was only now beginning to understand, was simply a fact. I kept my remarks brief. I had written and discarded 3 longer versions over the previous 2 weeks, all of them too explanatory, too defensive, too focused on context that the audience didn't need. What I arrived at in the end was shorter and closer to honest. I spent a long time believing that the best way to find out what mattered to someone was to let them believe you had nothing, I said. I want to be clear that this was not wisdom. It was fear wearing the clothes of a strategy. What I actually learned from it was mostly what I should have already known, that you cannot build something real on a withheld foundation. These students aren't here because I kept anything hidden. They're here because eventually I stopped. There was applause, which I acknowledged, and moved past as quickly as was polite. I saw Vanessa near the back of the room when I stepped away from the podium. She was standing slightly apart from the nearest group of people wearing a coat I didn't recognize, which meant it was recent purchased after everything had already happened. She was watching the room rather than looking at me, though she knew I had seen her. She didn't approach. She didn't raise a hand in greeting. She simply stood there for a few minutes watching the scholarship recipients receive their certificates, watching Oliver laugh at something Margaret said, watching a version of a world that she had walked out of and could not walk back into. Then she turned and moved toward the exit, unhurried, without looking back. I watched her go. I did not feel the anger I might have expected, or the grief, or the particular tightness in the chest that had accompanied so many ordinary moments over the previous several months. What I felt was something closer to clarity, the specific quiet kind that comes after a long confusion finally resolves into something simple. She had made her choices. So had I. The consequences of both were now fully in motion, moving forward without requiring anything further from either of us. One of the scholarship recipients, a 19-year-old from the south side of Ashford named Tyler, who wanted to build infrastructure software for underserved municipalities, came up to me after the formal program ended and shook my hand. He said he had applied to the program 3 times before it officially launched submitting materials to the Foundation's preliminary intake form without knowing whether anything would come of it. He said he almost hadn't submitted the 3rd time. I told him I was glad he had. Walking out of that building into the April morning with the sun already high enough to be warm, I thought about the version of myself that had stood in the corridor of the Imperial Grand Hotel 4 months earlier. Tired, clear-eyed, walking away from a room that had just finished performing its verdict on who I was. That man had made the right decision. He just hadn't known yet what he was walking toward. Sometimes you don't know that part until you're already there. I got into the car and drove back toward the lake, and the road was quiet, and the morning was genuinely uncomplicatedly good. If this story made you think about the way we judge people, about what we choose to see, and what we choose to ignore, then it did what it was supposed to do. The people who humiliated Ethan that night weren't villains in the movie sense. They were just people who had decided without much thought that a quiet man in a plain suit had nothing worth respecting. That assumption cost them everything. And the lesson isn't that you should hide who you are until the right moment to reveal it. The real lesson is simpler. How you treat someone who appears to have nothing says everything about who you actually are. If you want more stories like this one, stories about dignity, about patience, about the kind of strength that doesn't need an audience, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss what's coming next. We'll see you in the next one.